Hello, this is Gary C. King. Welcome to my latest podcast. Today I'm going to be talking about Murder in Room 305, a book I originally wrote back in the early 1990s, originally titled Web of Deceit, but when I republished it as an ebook, I retitled it to Murder in Room 305. Murder in Room 305 actually starts out at Eugene, Oregon, at a four-star hotel that overlooks the Willamette River called the Valley River Inn. Nice place, at least it was back then. I'm sure it still is today. Katherine Ann Martini Lissy had gone to Eugene on a business trip. She didn't know it at the time, although she suspected it, but she didn't know for sure. She was being set up by her husband, Michael Lissy. Unbeknownst to her, he had taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy on her and had planned to have her murdered because of financial problems he was having. Now, of course, in today's world, $100,000 doesn't seem like much money. Really wasn't a lot of money back in the mid-1980s when this murder occurred, but apparently it was substantial enough for Lissy to hire a hitman to do his wife in. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Katherine Ann Martini, the murder victim in this case, was born in New York to an affluent, very good family. She graduated from Yale with a bright future in the banking business. She was young and beautiful and ambitious. Worked for the Bank of Boston, I believe, at the time that she moved west to Portland, Oregon. It was after her move to Portland that she met up with the likes of Michael David Lissy, a sleazy proprietor of a scuba diving equipment shop on Southwest Barber Boulevard. He also purportedly gave scuba lessons, but how she met up with the likes of this man is part of the mystery. Lissy, as I said, was a sleazy proprietor of a scuba diving school and a coke addict. He consorted with pimps and prostitutes and other known criminals, and apparently had nothing going for him, till he met Katherine. It was on July 6, 1984, that Katherine's raped body was found at the Valley River Inn by a hotel maid cleaning up that day. Okay, heading back to the Valley River Inn. I'll try to keep this in chronological order for clarity. Katherine had gone to her room for the day after dining in the hotel's dining room. There was a knock on her door. She half expected something based on the facts that came out later and testimony that was given and wiretap conversations that I was privy to. It seemed to me that she knew something was up and maybe thought that she could figure out a way to get out of it or turn it around on Lissy. It's not really clear, never was, never will be probably. Anyway, she invited this man into her room after he knocked on the door and immediately knew that he worked for Lissy, her husband. At one point, he roughed her up a bit. Make a long story short, he ended up strangling her on the bed with probably a belt and left her naked body lying there face down for the maid to find the next day. Now, part of the conversation that came out of one of the wiretaps later on was simply this, and this is the killer, David Wilson, who, by the way, is out of prison now. I told her to roll on her stomach. Then I crawled on top of her, grabbed the gag, and I twisted it. She was out in seconds, never moved a muscle. She just laid there until I cut off her breath. Then I twisted it tighter and just held it there until her eyes bulged out and her face turned purple. "Didn't that freak you out?" asked the prostitute who was wearing the wire for the police, suddenly more aware of just how cold-blooded this man really was. And here she was, talking to him for the damn cops, listening to him get off as he related the details of Kathy's murder. Wilson ignored the question. "You ever murder anyone besides Kathy?" asked the prostitute. "Yep," Wilson answered. "It's nothing to me. You know I can ignore it like it isn't there if the money is right." Prostitute just nodded. But that gives you some kind of an idea of the cold-blooded mentality that went into this senseless murder that shouldn't have happened in the first place. The next day, one of the maids, as I said, found her body, notified the police. The investigation began. I first learned of the case from a newspaper article that appeared in the Oregonian newspaper. And it wasn't a large article, but it was enough to grab my interest. And I thought to myself, how could a woman from this background end up being murdered in a four-star hotel? So I waited and I watched for a while and followed the news on it until I realized that this was turning into a rather big case for the state of Oregon. And as I watched, I made it known to various contacts that I had that I would be writing a book about it. It was shortly after that Katherine came to Portland that she met Michael David Lissy. Following a whirlwind courtship, the two were married in January 1984. Detective Lloyd Davis was among the first to arrive in the detective division. He immediately interviewed the maid, observed the room, the body. Among the things that he learned that day was that Katherine's pants looked as if they had been stripped from her body, as they were found on the floor next to the bed where her body was found. He also, strangely, found a moistened tampon to the left of the night table, despite the fact that he learned later that Katherine was not into her menstrual cycle at the time of her death. That was a big mystery from the start as to why the tampon. As Davis and his partner, David Pope, continued the investigation at the hotel, they found a hotel matchbook on the bed next to Katherine's body. This small detail became significant later when the killer, David Wilson, told a prostitute who was working undercover for the police that he'd left a matchbook on the bed near Katherine's body, a fact that was known only to the police at the time. When it came time to autopsy the body, Katherine's face needed to be cleaned up before the autopsy could be performed, mainly because of the savagery of the murder. She had hemorrhaging of the eyes, a condition known as petechial hemorrhaging. It's a condition typical of strangulation victims. At this point, to the Eugene cops, all they had was a dead body in a hotel room, and they really didn't know the circumstances behind it, why Katherine Martini Lissy was murdered in the first place. So these cops knew from experience that even the simple investigations always took a lot of time. They basically began working around the clock to try to solve the case. Early in the investigation, Sergeant Michael Klein, another detective who was working the case with Davis and Pope, determined that Katherine Ann Martini Lissy was married to Michael David Lissy, who was essentially her next of kin at the time of her death. At one point, Detective Davis called Lissy and told him that he had every reason to believe that his wife was dead. Klein asked Lissy to come to the Eugene Police Department as soon as possible and requested that he bring several photographs of his wife with him. Lissy sounded pretty shaken up over the phone, to the point where he had to ask someone who was with him to finish the conversation, but there was still something kind of fishy about the whole thing. Lissy was very adept at putting on acts, and there was something that came through that made the cops suspicious of Lissy from the very beginning. When he arrived in Eugene a couple hours later after leaving his home in Lake Oswego, an affluent suburb of Portland, he was accompanied by a friend and neighbor. He turned over the photographs of his wife, and at that point, Davis basically told him that there was no doubt about it that his wife was the deceased person they found in room 305. He expressed his condolences. Lissy appeared to be in shock. It was almost as if he had expected the detective to tell him that it had all been a mistake and that it wasn't his wife that had really been found dead in room 305. Then, after the reality of it all seemed to settle in, he brought a hand to his brow and began crying. So at that point, even though Lissy was probably feigning being distraught, the detectives went ahead and started asking him pointed questions, such as, was Kathy a heavy drinker? Was she ever involved with narcotics of any kind? And so on and so forth. And it was when they got to the narcotics question that Lissy immediately stepped up and said, "Why, yes, she was." He replied without hesitation. Whenever she would come to Eugene, she would buy cocaine, he offered. His answer, or perhaps just the blunt abruptness of it, seemed to surprise Davis. Although he didn't tell Lissy, Davis didn't think Kathy seemed like the type of person who would have used illegal drugs. And in fact, as the investigation continued, it was shown that she wasn't that type of person. There seemed to be an orderliness to her life, not the kind of chaos that seems to accompany the lives of so many people using drugs. As Lissy continued to try and involve his deceased wife with drugs, he told the detectives that she usually just bought a gram at a time. At that time, it ranged in price from $100 to $125 per gram, and that it was easily obtainable in Eugene if a person knew the right people. But it seemed kind of strange to me, as an outsider looking in on this, why a person would drive to Eugene, 110 miles south of Portland. When you live in Portland, it's much easier to find sources for illicit drugs than just about anything else. He also implicated his wife in the use of other types of drugs, such as ecstasy and MDA, etc. Nothing could ever be shown that Katherine was ever involved in drugs. They learned later that Katherine had actually met Lissy when she decided to sign up for classes at his scuba diving shop. She didn't know very many people in town at that time, especially anyone who was qualified to be her partner for scuba diving. Lissy, after taking one look at her, he volunteered, and their relationship blossomed from there. It was while at Yale that Kathy had in fact joined the women's diving team. That was when her interest in scuba diving had actually begun. She just didn't take it to the next level until she reached Portland. When she arrived in Oregon, Kathy joined the network of business and professional women of Portland, to which she served on various functions, and in keeping with her well-established trait, gave generously of her time. In a display of appreciation for all of her hard work, not to mention being desirous of the continuance of her skills and abilities, the group soon elected her as their president, one of the youngest ever. Life seemed golden for Kathy, and she enjoyed a good salary from her job, traveled with all expenses paid, drove an expensive sports car, and lived in a luxurious condominium in the affluent Portland suburb of Lake Oswego that overlooked the lake after which the town was named. So most people kept asking themselves, why in God's name did she hook up with someone like Michael David Lissy? According to her friends, Kathy really was impressed by Lissy. She fell in love with him almost immediately. Again, only God knows why. In one of his boastful moods, Michael lied to Kathy and told her that he had graduated from Harvard and Oxford universities. This had impressed his new bride, and she was proud to be married to a highly educated, successful businessman. He also told her that he was going to head a dive for the National Geographic Society, and that he held diving contracts with the Department of Defense and the Department of State. Kathy was overwhelmed and fascinated, of course, and began telling her friends that Michael would get mysterious telephone calls in the middle of the night and would have to go to another room to talk about top-secret diving plans he had made with the government. She was initially intrigued by her husband's mysteriousness, and her friends would later say she truly believed that she had found the man of her dreams. Little did she know that these phone calls were not with the Department of Defense or with anyone else from the government, but were pimps, prostitutes, and drug dealers. And he would use the excuse that he had these top-secret missions to leave Kathy by herself and go out and cavort with them. Never, even for an instant, according to her friends, did Kathy envision that her pipe dream would come to an abrupt end, a dead halt, because of the evil plotting and sinister actions of her husband. When informed of Kathy's untimely death, none of her friends and acquaintances could think of anyone who would want to do her harm. Moving ahead a bit, following Kathy's murder in Eugene, a 17-year-old prostitute in Portland was reading the morning news, and she saw an article about Katherine. She said, "He did it. Oh my God, he did it," to herself. She was hysterical and began crying as she continued to exclaim over and over, "He did it." "Did what?" asked her boyfriend. "Who did what?" It took the young woman nearly 10 minutes to calm down to the point where she could explain why she was so upset. Shaking with trepidation and fear, she told her boyfriend that she had met a man named Michael David Lissy a few months earlier in downtown Portland, and that Lissy had asked her to help him find a hitman to kill a young woman. Her boyfriend, shocked and himself fearful over what the girl had told him, advised his girlfriend to contact the Eugene Police Department, which she did a few minutes later after composing herself. She finally got Detective Davis on the line and explained what she knew. The girl was obviously a troubled girl, found herself in circumstances that she now regretted. She nonetheless stepped up and told what she knew about Lissy's plans to have a young woman killed. Davis wanted to know what made her think that Lissy was involved in the death of his wife, and she responded to him that because what I read was the same manner of death that he had described to me, and because she was young, because it fit exactly the same description that he had given me previously. The girl told Davis that a month earlier, Lissy had been involved in a scheme in which he was trying to intimidate a woman, although she didn't know the woman's identity. The scheme had involved him hiring this young prostitute, in which he paid her $100 for each of 3 telephone calls that she made to this mystery woman. Basically, the calls were of a threatening nature that demanded the woman play ball with Lissy and keep her mouth shut, do what Lissy wanted her to do, or he would expose some of her previous activities that she wasn't so proud of. Although she was never certain of his intentions, the young woman thought that Lissy's intentions had been a form of blackmail and intimidation. When she returned to telling her story to Davis about Lissy wanting to hire a hitman, she explained that Lissy had wanted the strangulation to look like a robbery and/or rape motivated, so that it would throw the police off track and send them in the wrong direction. She said that Lissy had told her that he would be willing to pay her money if she could find someone who would be willing to do the job. He had figured that she would know someone like that, someone who would kill for money, because she was a street girl and hung out with people who would do almost anything for the right amount of cash. He knew, too, that some of these people wouldn't require much money to do the job. The girl said that she had candidly acknowledged to Lissy that she might know several people like he wanted to hire. When Lissy had first started talking, she thought that it was all a lot of bullshit, for which Lissy was well known, and that it really wouldn't go anywhere. But after reading about Katherine's murder in the newspaper, she realized that he hadn't been joking, at least not this time. A little later, Detectives Lloyd Davis and David Pope traveled to Michael Lissy's condominium in Lake Oswego, making the 2-hour trip from Eugene. It would mark their third contact with Katherine's husband, who they both agreed was fast becoming a more viable suspect in Kathy's murder with each passing day. Lissy met them at the door and informed them that Kathy's 2 sisters and parents were inside the residence. After exchanging greetings with Kathy's relatives, Lissy ushered the 2 detectives, at their request, back to the den where they could again talk privately with him. Even though they had asked him previously, the 2 detectives wanted to know when Lissy had first become aware of Kathy's business trip to Eugene. It was through the repetition of questions and answers that inconsistencies in a suspect's statements sometimes occur, a common technique used by the police. They had more than enough reasons to look for inconsistencies in Lissy's statements, and to place him as a higher priority suspect. They had received the unsettling telephone call from the young woman, and a search of Kathy's belongings found in room 305 had turned up a partially used tube of toothpaste inside a cosmetics purse that had been packed inside a larger overnight bag. The toothpaste turned out to be the very item that Lissy had previously told them that Kathy had forgotten to take with her, and had called home and talked to him about it after she arrived in Eugene. It was such an unacceptable excuse for anyone to call home about. And after finding the toothpaste, they considered it an outright lie that Lissy had told them. They talked more about Kathy's supposed cocaine connection in Eugene, and Lissy, of course, told them more lies. When they were getting ready to leave, the 2 detectives asked him to provide them with a rundown of his activities, or his whereabouts, on the 5th and 6th of the month in which Kathy was killed. Again, they were looking for inconsistencies in his statements, lies, in other words, which he was well known for telling, as well as attempting to bring any new information to the service that might have been previously omitted or overlooked. So he ran them through his days. None of it really amounted to much. He told them places that he'd been, bars, a trip to the coast, visiting with his friend, and so forth. Anything to give him an alibi, which he didn't really need because he really hadn't gone to Eugene. On the day Kathy's body was found, Lissy told the cops that he'd gone to work at his usual time, 9:45 a.m., and he planned to take his van to an upholstery shop to get the seats repaired, but couldn't remember whether he had done so or not on that particular day. And on it went, just more of the same. It was clear, though, that the detectives were beginning to zero in on Lissy as a suspect. In the book, I get into the elements of their lives together, in particular, Lissy's sex life. At any rate, the story was fast becoming a big story in Oregon. Each day it seemed like there were new headlines about the case. Shortly after their initial contact with the 17-year-old girl, Davis and Pope spoke with another officer from Portland Police Bureau and confirmed what the young woman had told Davis and Pope about Lissy frequenting the area of Southwest 4th Avenue and Taylor Streets in downtown Portland, where Lissy and the young girl repeatedly engaged in fellatio for a fee. The Portland officer told the detectives that he knew Michael Lissy and that during May 1984 he had seen him in the aforementioned areas on 3 or 4 occasions. On one of those occasions, he said that Lissy had told him that he was having financial problems and was very near having to file for bankruptcy. The young girl, meanwhile, reiterated what Lissy had told her in June about wanting several people killed and another person beaten severely, and said that he wanted a young man beaten because he was somehow fucking up the money flow, and said that he wanted an older couple killed because they were standing in the way of some sort of development that Lissy was supposedly involved in. The older couple turned out later on, I'll just jump ahead to that here, but the older couple later on turned out to be Lissy's parents. Lissy had suggested to the young woman that the older couple be killed in a way that would appear to be an accident, like having them fall down a long flight of stairs or having them pushed off a boat. This was all in addition, of course, to having the young woman raped and strangled in Eugene. The scenario that involved the young prostitute broadened and intensified soon after Davis and Pope obtained a court order for her to wear a body wire, a transmitting device that sends out voice transmission signals that can be received and recorded by police using special receiving equipment tuned to a particular frequency. The plan was to have the young woman talk to Lissy while wearing the body wire, whereby he would, they hoped, make incriminating admissions of his involvement in or take responsibility for his wife's murder. However, when the young woman called Lissy the first time, the plan went awry when he refused to meet with her in person. Davis and Pope didn't quite know what to make of it. They thought that perhaps he had been alarmed by their visit to him at his condo and had perhaps been spooked by their questions, or perhaps he had suddenly become paranoid. Even though Lissy wouldn't meet with the young woman on the first attempt, Davis and Pope didn't give up. They checked the woman into a room at the Portland Motor Hotel where they would keep her safe from Lissy for the next several days. It was located downtown near a location where she had met Lissy on prior occasions. Using telephone wiretap equipment, she had continued calling him. Finally, on the third such attempt, Lissy agreed to meet her at noon on July 12th at Portland's downtown Yamhill Market, a multi-level galleria of stores and restaurants that encompasses an entire city block. The young woman waited patiently. She walked around the market, stopped at shops, looking at greeting cards, until finally she saw Lissy drive by in a maroon Datsun 300Z. He appeared to glance in her direction but did not stop. For some reason, perhaps he sensed the police surveillance, Lissy did not return. The young woman returned to her hotel room and called Lissy again. She arranged a second meeting at the same location for 2 p.m. that same day, but that time Lissy didn't show up at all. Despite the failed attempts to lure Lissy into a meeting with the young woman, the cops didn't want to give up. They instructed her to call him again, but he was reluctant to meet her anywhere until she said, and I quote, "This sounded just like the plot you described to me when you wanted to have someone killed. I am worried that I am involved, and I want you to help me get away because the police will be contacting me. I need some money to get out of town," end quote. Wishing to shut her up, he finally agreed to meet her at a downtown Denny's restaurant. She arrived about 5 minutes early, just before 9:30 p.m., and the police surveillance team was already in position and out of sight. She walked across the parking lot and headed toward the restaurant's entrance. Someone yelled at her as she reached for the door. She turned and saw Lissy sitting on a low cement wall, several yards away in an area obscured by bushes. She walked toward him. "Let's go somewhere," he said, motioning toward his blue van parked nearby. "No, let's go inside, get a cup of coffee," she said, fearful for her life. She recalled how Lissy had asked her to help him find a hitman, and her boyfriend had warned her to stay away from him. She also recalled how he had come downtown in his van a few times after having made the request for her to find him a hitman and would follow her. She didn't know precisely how many times he had actually followed her and watched her from a distance, but on the occasions that she had seen him, she always turned and walked the other way because she was scared of him. But sometimes he would park his van, get out, and try to follow her on foot, which had frightened her even more. Now she was meeting with him after his wife had been murdered, and she was terrified. He kept pushing her to get inside his van so they could go somewhere. The young woman insisted that they go inside for coffee. Eventually, Lissy reluctantly agreed. After being seated at a booth and receiving their coffee, she began talking about Kathy's murder and the fact that she had heard that she might have been raped. "I think my phone's tapped," Lissy said. "That's why I didn't want you talking about the murder over the phone." Lissy, of course, was only guessing. He didn't know for certain that Davis and Pope had applied for and received a court order to have a device installed by Pacific Northwest Bell Telephone Company that would register all numbers dialed from Lissy's home telephone number, but he suspected it and was being very careful about who he called. "How do you know it's tapped?" she asked. "I can hear little clicking sounds." "It's tapped. I'm almost certain of it." "I believe you had your wife killed," the woman said. "I loved Kathy," Lissy said. "I'm really fucking upset about it. She was strangled and raped." She reminded Lissy that he had told her that the woman he wanted killed would be strangled and raped, but he didn't take the bait. He sat quietly instead and did not respond. "Did you bring the money so I can get out of town?" she asked. "No, we have to go to the bank and get it." He explained that he had to withdraw the money from an automatic teller machine. "I'll wait here," she insisted. "I'll be back in 2.5 minutes. Lissy realized at that point that the young woman wasn't going to go anywhere with him. He didn't give up easily. "Why don't you go to the Red Lion Inn next door and meet me there?" The Red Lion was a hotel located adjacent to Denny's. The young woman didn't want to risk crossing the dark parking lot to comply with his wishes. She was afraid that she might not be in sight of the police at some point, and that he might meet her in the shadows and drag her into his own van. "No, I'll wait here for you," she said. Lissy didn't persist any longer. He got up from their table and walked quickly out of the restaurant. After Lissy left, she got up and waited inside the entrance area of the restaurant. A few minutes later, she saw Lissy's van pull up in the taxi zone on Lincoln Street, at which point she walked outside. Lissy rolled down the window of his van and handed her a wad of bills just below the window line so that it couldn't be seen from the outside of anyone who might be watching. She grabbed it, put it inside her purse, and climbed into a cab that she had instructed to be waiting nearby. Short time later, police found the $300 in her purse, the money Lissy had given her to leave town. And by now, the young woman was going to turn state's evidence instead and help get him convicted. A short time later, a man by the name of David Wilson, 31 years old at the time, came up as the police continued their contact with a number of street people in Portland. They had reason to believe that Wilson was somehow involved in Kathy's murder, possibly as a hitman hired by Lissy. Wilson's name had come up when Davis and Pope learned about and contacted a 20-year-old prostitute, a tough-looking, tough-talking woman aged beyond her years, who sometimes acted as a pimp for Lissy on occasion by soliciting dates for him with young prostitutes in exchange for a fee. When they checked out her background with the Portland Police Bureau, Davis and Pope learned she had been associated with the subject who had been arrested for soliciting customers for prostitutes. Although they hadn't obtained information that she herself performed sexual acts for money, Davis and Pope soon learned from another street person, female, that the woman that they were looking at was a lesbian, which in turn explained why she and Lissy hadn't become involved sexually and why she was acting as a pimp of sorts for him. During one of their first interviews with the lesbian woman, she admitted to setting up dates with prostitutes for Lissy. She also told the detectives that she had set up a 15-year-old hooker for Lissy and remarked that she was into child molesting herself. She told them that one of the dates she'd set up for Lissy had occurred 1 week after Kathy's death. She denied any involvement in the death of Lissy's wife, and she denied knowing David Wilson. As a result, Davis and Pope continued their investigation and interviews with other street people, hoping to make the connection of how David Wilson and Michael Lissy became acquainted. Under pressure of being called before a grand jury and possibly indicted on some kind of charge related to the case, another prostitute reluctantly told the cops that both the lesbian woman and David Wilson had told her that they had driven to Eugene in a car belonging to the lesbian prostitute's cousin, who, herself, another prostitute. It was a 1973 Oldsmobile, and they had driven to Eugene for the purpose of Wilson to kill Lissy's wife. According to the information learned by the cops from their interviews with these numerous street people, the lesbian pimp knew Kathy's room number at the Valley River Inn, presumably having obtained it from Lissy or from calling the front desk. She and David Wilson had apparently told another woman, yet another prostitute, that the lesbian pimp had gained entry into Kathy's room and that she, the pimp, had let David Wilson into the room a short time later. The pimp then returned to the car, leaving David Wilson to kill Kathy. Of course, Davis and Pope didn't know how much of the story was fact or fiction. Sometimes stories had a way of changing as they were passed along from one person to the next, but they were determined to put it all together and learn the truth. According to one of the people the detectives spoke with, the lesbian, which I'm referring to people in a generic sense by the positions and the type of lives that they held, because there's really no reason at this point in time for the public to know their true identities, so I'm not even going to give them fictitious names in this podcast, though I have given them fictitious names in the book. The lesbian knew Kathy's room number at the Valley River Inn. She and David Wilson had apparently told another prostitute that the lesbian pimp had gained entry into Kathy's room. That's kind of a hazy point. We don't really know for sure whether she knocked on the door, Kathy let her in, or what, but she did say that she gained entry into Kathy's room and that she later had let David Wilson into the room. Regardless of how David Wilson got into the room, whether being let into the room by Kathy herself or by being let into the room by Lissy's lesbian pimp, whatever the case was, the pimp returned to the car and left David Wilson in the room to kill Kathy. The pimp had purportedly told another woman that she and Wilson had been instructed to take property from Kathy to make the murder appear to be motivated by robbery. Wilson, however, took more of Kathy's things than he was supposed to, which had angered the pimp. The pimp said that Wilson had told her that he had taken Kathy's property as collateral in case Lissy did not pay them as he had promised. She also told another woman that she was upset with Wilson because he had not taken Kathy's $6,000 wedding ring off her body after the killing. It didn't take Davis and Pope very long to decide that these were some pretty cold-blooded people with whom they were dealing, people who obviously held very little value for human life unless it was their own. Moving ahead, as the investigation continued, Davis and Pope learned of yet another woman, another prostitute, 19 years old, who had recently given birth to a child. They learned that she had first met Lissy during the summer of 1983. She had actually worked for him, and Davis and Pope turned up information which indicated she was also involved sexually with Lissy in return for money, in addition to working on the streets of Portland as a prostitute. By the time Davis and Pope had tracked her down, the prostitute had learned that she had been implicated in Kathy's murder and was naturally pretty shaken up. At first, she wouldn't talk to the detectives, and they had to piece the story together from the statements that they had already obtained from others. 3 months before giving birth to her child, during her second trimester, she had gone on a date with Lissy at the apartment that he held across the street from his scuba diving center on Barber Boulevard. It was during this sexual encounter that Lissy told her he was looking for somebody to commit a killing for him. He had asked her if she knew somebody who would do it for him. He said that he wanted a lady killed and probably raped, and he had wanted her strangled or hit over the head. He told her that he wanted both the woman and the boyfriend of his ex-wife, before Katherine, done in as well, indicating that he would pay up to $10,000 for the job. He told the prostitute that he would give her $500 if she introduced him to somebody, and she had assured him that she would look into it. After the sexual encounter with Lissy, the prostitute went to the home of another friend, a house that was known in the drug underworld as a tweak house. Tweak being a slang term for the feeling a person gets when injecting and or snorting speed or methamphetamine. The tweak house was frequented by this particular prostitute as well as others that Lissy had known, and also by David Wilson and a number of other people who liked to abuse illicit drugs. While there, the prostitute asked if they knew anyone who would kill somebody for $10,000. David Wilson, who was taking drugs with some of the others, told her that he would do it. According to the story that the detectives were being told, the prostitute then telephoned Lissy and arranged a meeting between him and Wilson. Soon thereafter, the prostitute and Wilson met with Lissy again, at which time Lissy gave Wilson an as-yet undetermined amount of money so that he could get a haircut, buy a suit, and obtain a rental car. The person to be killed, he had told them, was out of town in a motel, and Lissy wanted Wilson to look respectable so that he would fit in with the environment. Lissy told Wilson that he wanted a rape and said that the murder had to be done by 8 p.m. on July 5th. He said the lady would be expecting somebody named Steve. When they ran a check on Wilson, Davis and Pope learned of an unrelated arrest from 1983 that produced a mugshot of him. When they looked at Wilson's photo, they were astounded when they realized that Lissy and Wilson were practically doubles of each other. When they laid down the mugshot of Wilson alongside a mugshot of Lissy that was taken in Clark County, Washington a few years before, they noted that the resemblance was uncanny. A short time later, in an effort to shake things up a bit, it was decided to present the facts of the case to a Lane County grand jury. This occurred on September 25, 1984. 2 weeks earlier, Davis and Pope served subpoenas on Michael Lissy and all of the other people involved, including David Wilson and the prostitutes in question, as well as others. Each were advised that their appearances were mandatory, and if they failed to appear, a warrant would be issued for their arrest. The prostitute that brought Lissy and Wilson together didn't show up. Instead, she called from a point along Interstate 5 and told the detectives that her car had broken down. Davis and Pope tried to impress upon her that if she didn't come clean with what she knew about Lissy's involvement in Kathy's murder, she would do hard jail time right along with Lissy and Wilson. The grand jury, meanwhile, didn't get much out of the others, although some evidence was taken during the proceedings, including testimony, hair samples, fingerprints, handwriting samples, anything that might fit in and help make the case. Indictments weren't yet handed down. It was decided that Lissy's fingerprints were found on one of the $50 bills that he had given the young woman to get out of town earlier, and some of Wilson's head and pubic hairs were determined to be microscopically similar to those found inside Kathy's hotel room. But it still wasn't enough to make arrests, and readers and listeners should recall that this was at a time before DNA analysis had come fully into play. It was just really being explored and being launched as far as police work is concerned at this time. So the cops really needed something more conclusive. At one point, the 19-year-old prostitute who had recently given birth was persuaded to have a conversation with David Wilson. Since she's the one who brought David Wilson and Lissy together, the cops reasoned that she would be the perfect one to talk with Wilson, her wearing the wire. She was, of course, afraid, considering that she now knew what he had done. The meeting was arranged. Wilson showed up at a home where this young woman was at and said, "Well, hello there," when she opened the door. They went outside. Her fear was probably not showing through, at least not at first, and she told Wilson she could only stay for a couple of minutes. He didn't really like to go be outside because it was cold. He told her, he said, "I'd expected to be arrested by now." "Yeah," she agreed. From their vantage point, half a block up the street, the cops could see the young woman and Wilson near the front door of the house, but they could not distinguish many details, just two figures talking to each other in the dark. For that reason, they needed to confirm Wilson's identity visually, and as such, one of the officers wearing street clothes drew the lucky straw to walk down the sidewalk in front of the house. Just before making the short jaunt, the officer had looked at a Portland Police Bureau mugshot of Wilson, taken during a prior arrest unrelated to the Lissy case. When he returned to his colleagues after walking around the block, he told them that the young woman was in fact talking to David Wilson. "Do you know if anybody else has been subpoenaed or anything?" Wilson asked her. "No," she responded. "Well, I think they're at a standstill," Wilson stated. "They might not have been able to get an indictment." "Are you sure?" she asked. "Well, I can't be sure," Wilson said. I'm sure they would have arrested me by now." "I don't know," the young woman offered. "They probably wanted to get enough to make it stick." "What else can they get?" Wilson asked. "The only thing they possibly could have gotten was hair and prints." "That's all they could have gotten from you in the room?" The young woman was fishing, trying to get Wilson to say something, anything incriminating that would place him at the crime scene. "I don't think they could get any prints," Wilson said confidently. "I don't think they could come up with any prints in the room. I know exactly what I touched." "What?" the young woman asked, pushing. "I touched an ashtray," Wilson admitted, "but I wiped it with the bedspread. In fact, I left it setting right on the bed." Wilson seemed proud of himself, as if the ashtray with no fingerprints would taunt the police. "And everything else I touched left the room with me," Wilson confessed. "What all did you take out of the room?" she asked. "Seriously, because I'm hearing about these credit cards, and I asked you on another occasion what you did with them, and you said they were stashed. Where are they?" "They aren't stashed," Wilson said. He thought for a moment and then added, "Well, some of them are stashed, but I won't tell nobody where they are." "I'm not asking you where," she asked. "I'm just asking if you've got them. You could go back and get them if you tried, right?" "Uh-huh," Wilson agreed. "Except that part of them I spread around in Eugene, where somebody'd pick them up and possibly use them. And that's what happened. That's why they took the handwriting analysis, the checks, everything." As the wiretap conversation continued, the young woman wanted to get Wilson recorded, describing the murder and what happened in room 305. "What happened when you guys were laying on the bed?" she asked. "She started asking questions," Wilson said, laughing, "and I said, 'I ain't telling you nothing.' So she said, 'How come Michael set me up?' I said, 'Michael who?' And I said, 'Are you married?' 'You're married.' And she said, 'Yeah, to Michael.' 'Michael Lissy,' the young woman said. I said, 'Michael who?' Wilson stated. I says, 'Michael. I don't know any Michael.' And anyway, she started asking me a lot of questions, like, 'What are you doing this for? And what does he want?' I says, 'I ain't answering no questions. You want to talk business, we'll talk business.' I just told her, 'Get on your stomach.'" Wilson was really enjoying this. "And then what?" the woman asked. "And then the gag was pulled down around her throat, right?" He describes how he strangled her and held the ligature until she died. She just laid there. She was out instantly. It takes 2 seconds to put somebody out when you cut off the jugular vein without ever choking her. I cut off her breath. "Don't you do that to me," the prostitute told him, thinking ahead to the deal she'd made with him about going to bed with him before he turned himself in. "Shit," she said. "I was just saying," Wilson offered, "that I could make you go out without killing you. Just make you go out. 2 to 3 seconds, you'd be out like a light." But she was still breathing. So I said, "Die, bitch." "Did she hear you?" asked the prostitute. "No, she was out." And then I just twisted the gag without letting go. I just got up and I walked around her once and twisted it tighter, and then I held it there. "Do you want to hear everything?" Wilson asked her. "Yeah, go ahead," she said. "Till her eyes bulged out." "Her eyes bulged out?" "Till her face turned purple." "Oh," said the woman, feeling sick inside. "And until her body quit twitching." "At least she wasn't awake for it all," the prostitute said, hopeful tone in her voice. "No, she was out cold. She never felt nothing." As the cops listened to this wiretap, it went on for quite some time. They realized what type of person they were dealing with, that he was very cold-blooded, very unfeeling, and actually seemed to enjoy reliving his experience of murdering Katherine. As the case continued, Detectives Lloyd Davis and David Pope began coordinating their efforts to arrest Michael Lissy and David Wilson separately. Michael Lissy at his parents' home at Lincoln Beach on the Oregon coast near Depot Bay, and at David Wilson's residence in Beaverton. When the go-ahead signal was given, Davis and Pope, along with several uniformed officers, converged on the Lissy home, while Washington County authorities did likewise at the Wilson residence 100 miles away. Neither man seemed particularly surprised by their arrest, and they remained quiet during their respective 2-hour drive to the Lane County Jail in Eugene. When they arrived there, Lissy and Wilson were booked separately so that they wouldn't have any opportunity to make contact with one another. They were held without bail on accusations of aggravated murder. Each was also charged with murder, robbery, rape, and sexual abuse, all in the first degree, in connection with Katherine Ann Martini Lissy's death. And the state was alleging that this was a contract killing, a killing for hire, that Lissy contracted to pay Wilson for the death of his wife. Both men, of course, pled not guilty. Eventually, they were brought to trial, and it goes without saying that some of the trial testimony I should share with you here in this podcast, just to give you a feeling of how brazen Lissy could be. At Lissy's trial, he was dressed in a suit and looked respectable, not at all the despicable person that he was being portrayed as. One of the big mistakes, I believe, was putting Lissy on the witness stand himself. That was just an opinion of mine based on the fact that defense attorneys rarely put their client on the witness stand. Lissy did an excellent job in hanging himself. I'll read to you some of the testimony. Lissy brazenly told the jury that the murder plans he was accused of participating in were nothing more than mere fantasized plots that he had constructed just for kicks. The catch, he said, was that he never told his associates, the pimps and the prostitutes that were his friends, that his plots were just a fantasy. If he had told them about his fantasy, he said, and I quote, "then there's no more game going on. If it's not real, people don't want to play." There had been 2 other plots and 3 other hitmen, besides Wilson, that the young prostitute had brought me. Nothing ever happened, Lissy testified. I don't think we ever backed out. It's just the time to do it expired. I've asked myself 10,000 times, why didn't you see it was going to happen? It just never did. If the plotting was a rush, getting involved in all that. Is there a logical reason? No, it was just something I did. There was basically one plot, but probably 15 different people who had been involved in the plotting. That Kathy would be killed in Eugene while on a business trip at the Valley River Inn. I was hoping against hope and praying like hell that I wasn't involved, Lissy told the jury in describing his feelings when the police contacted him on July 6 to inform him that his wife had been murdered. You can talk about somebody dying and then have it happen and not wonder. Would you lie to get off this murder charge? The prosecutor asked him. I'm sure I probably would, Lissy replied. After thinking about what he'd just said, Lissy quickly changed his statement. I probably would have at one point. I wouldn't now. I've always, when I was cornered, used what I could. Lissy said that he'd been able to lie straight-faced for as long as he could remember. You'd do whatever you could to survive, wouldn't you? Asked the prosecutor. That's right, Lissy replied. I lied repeatedly to the police. I did not want to be charged with the murder of my wife. Although Lissy said, I think I'm responsible for Kathy's death, he maintained throughout his trial that he had never intended for her to actually be killed. Instead, he said the street people he associated with had taken it upon themselves to carry out the fantasy plots because they thought the plots were for real. What about the large sums of money that he had paid out? Prosecutors wanted to know. Lissy claimed that the money was paid as bribes to keep Wilson and others quiet after the murder had occurred. Right afterward, Lissy said, I paid a lot of bribes to people to keep quiet. It came down to paying off the people who were involved. The jury didn't believe a word of what Lissy had to say, and they found him guilty of aggravated murder in the July 5, 1984 death of his wife. Lissy waived his right to a pre-sentence investigation, and Lane County Circuit Court Judge William A. Beckett immediately sentenced Lissy to life in prison and imposed a 30-year mandatory minimum sentence before Lissy could be eligible for parole. Since Oregon did not have a death penalty in 1985, a sentence of death was not an issue in sentencing Lissy. Lissy was promptly taken to the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem to begin serving his sentence. David Wilson, in the meantime, didn't waste any time. The day after Lissy's conviction and sentence, Wilson pleaded guilty to stipulated facts in his case to avoid facing a trial by jury and potentially longer prison sentences. Wilson pleaded guilty to aggravated murder in connection with Kathy's death and was sentenced by Lane County Circuit Court Judge George Woodrich to life in prison. Despite Wilson's guilty plea, however, Woodrich imposed a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years before parole eligibility. However, you should note at this time that David Wilson is now out of prison. He was released in the late 1990s or very early this century after getting out early on good behavior. Michael Lissy is up for parole at any time. His current whereabouts are not known to me. I'm following closely to find out when he's released so I can give my readers an update on that at the appropriate time. In wrapping up this podcast, I just want to say I had some excellent source material. I went to the Lane County Prosecutor's Office and they brought me out a couple of boxes of materials and told me to have at it and to copy what I needed. And it was excellent material in addition to the interviews that I conducted, as well as photographs provided. The wiretap tapes were particularly intriguing. I didn't transcribe them verbatim in the book, but enough is there to give the reader a feel for what actually transpired between the young prostitute and David Wilson. And that just about wraps it up. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. In the meantime, follow me on facebook.com/truecrimeking, or on my website. You can find more information about my books, truecrimeking.com. And you can also follow me on Twitter, where I'm pretty active. Until next time, stay tuned.